going to take just a minute to introduce the next introducer. On this subject matter, I'll be learning from my friend Doug Ammar as much as I've learned from anybody. And we've known each other, I think, for 20 years. And Doug will tell you, I don't know, nearly 20 years he's had interns at the Georgia Justice Project. He's a graduate of Washington University Law School, and very happy to have him here today. Sidney Biggs and Heath Barnadoe, intern at the Georgia Justice Project. He's here to introduce James Forman.
Thank you, Harlan. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here, and I'm speaking for our organization, the Georgia Justice Project. We've enjoyed and benefited greatly from the great service for the 20 years we've worked with the program. And obviously this summer, Heath and Sidney, I saw Heath for Sidney, is she for somewhere? Did a great job. Thank you for your great work this summer. It is really my honor to introduce Professor Forman today. I think the main reason I was asked to do this is because it turns out that we actually have a number of things in common, most importantly, which is Atlanta. It turns out that he actually, Professor Forman, many accolades. He graduated from Roosevelt High School in Atlanta, which it turns out when I moved to Atlanta for the first time in the mid-80s, I lived about 2 blocks from where he was in school. We almost overlapped each other within a few blocks, and I think that's why I'm here today. No, it's a great honor. So many of you have hopefully read his impressive and amazing bio. He's currently a professor at Yale Law School, but he's been visiting at Stanford Law School. He's also visited at Columbia, NYU, Michigan. He's been a professor, of course, at Georgetown, where I'm sure he and the former speaker, Paul, as former antagonists in the courthouses in D.C., as well as professors together at Georgetown, got in lots of good arguments and conversations. I'm not trying to get into the middle of that. In addition to graduating from Roosevelt High School, which unfortunately, by the way, as you know, has been closed and is now a condominium, and they have a new high school right down the hill called Maynard Jackson High School, in a neighborhood that I've lived around and in for years. But he is a graduate of Brown University, graduate of magna cum laude, and went to Yale Law School as well. Was on the Yale Law Review, the book editor there. He clerked for 2 judges, which in the law school world, and this is all incredibly impressive. I know for you undergraduates, what does this mean? This is really heavy stuff. This is great stuff. He clerked for both Judge William Norris in the Ninth Circuit, as well as Sandra O'Connor on the Supreme Court. He worked immediately after working for Sandra O'Connor, which is an unusual move. He talks about, I think, a little bit in his book, for PDS, the Public Defender Services in D.C., often considered the best public defender office in the country. From there, he went on to found the Maya Angelou Charter School, which is still in existence and has grown quite considerably, it seems, since you started that. And I think that's when I first learned of you, when I was bumping into folks, friends of mine who worked at PDS. And since then, he's been a professor, as I mentioned. But he's here today, I'm sure, to talk about his amazing work on criminal justice. And I won't go into all that, but I do want to talk about his book that has just come out, Locking Up Our Own, which is a focus, obviously, on criminal justice. But his work has been broader than that. Almost every paper and lecture he's given has been this intersection of criminal justice and rehabilitation and redemption, youth, and how the system works and doesn't work too often. And one of his expressions I love about his book is when talking about responses to crime and responses to really difficult social circumstances, he talks about whether is the response all the above, meaning more jobs, more health care, more opportunity for people, or is it just one that we should lock people up when they have been arrested and convicted? In his book, he talks about how it's not a monolithic approach that led us to where we are today, being the world's leader in incarceration. And I really appreciate that, breaking down civic and county and state approaches, and uses the D.C. in particular to focus on how one community, a community led primarily by African Americans, has at the time increased and was part of this movement of mass incarceration. So his analysis, I think, is incredibly new and fresh, and gives us great pause to think about how we got here. But it's not just that. Instead of being overwhelmed, like so many of us are, by the criminal justice system, by mass incarceration, by the racial disparity, his message is one, I believe, that's infused with hope. It's because he asked the question throughout is what is our response to injustice? What should we do? And what can we do? After Rodney King's, the acquittal of the officers who did Rodney King, there's a wonderful article in Atlantic 2 years ago where he reflects on a conversation he had with his father, the famed civil rights leader James Forman Sr. And he talks that the response that he got from his dad when he was hoping for hope in the early 90s about how to respond to crime and police brutality and Professor Forman's work as a public defender. And his father responded really about the permanence of injustice. And for many of us, that would presume to leave us flat and lay us down and lay us without them. But instead, I believe that Professor Forman interpreted that as that, and his way that his father gave it to him, is that we always have to fight for injustice. There will always be injustice. But the question is, what is our response? And what can we do? I believe that's a question we all should be asking ourselves in any issue. What can we do? How can we fight injustice? How can we fight for humanity? Let me just say, as a person who grew up in two different ecumenical Yale Law School perspectives, one Presbyterian and the other Syrian Orthodox, I believe the Eastern Church has a great expression for this, a great understanding that injustice and oppression will always be with us. The darkness will always be with us. The Western Church somehow believes, in our Western tradition, that we'll somehow overcome injustice. And I believe, unfortunately, that justice, like your father said to you, Professor Forman, will always be with us. And it's not the question whether we can overcome it. The question is, what is our response? And I encourage all of us to think about, what is our response to injustice? What have you done? Can we stand up to those, stand up for those without power? Can we bear witness to redemption? Can we bear witness to the humanity of the least of these? Can we fight for rehabilitation? Can we bear witness to a higher power? I believe that Professor Forman, in all of his work, in his academic work, his work as a lawyer representing people, and his amazing work in his book, he, like his statement, has done all the above. Professor Forman.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Doug, thank you for that incredible introduction. Harlan, thank you for organizing this and inviting me. Thank all of y'all for coming today, but also for the work that you've been doing all summer. I want to thank our hosts here at VMI for putting this on. I teach a case about VMI in law school, and it's not a great moment in American history. So I never really thought I'd be at VMI. I'm glad to be here. I want to thank Paul Butler, who spoke before me. Every single time he speaks, I learn something new. Every single time he writes, I learn something new. As good as his talk was, his book, if you can believe it, is even better, and I hope you have a chance to pick it up. I want to thank Robin Steinberg, who I'm just getting to know, but whose work at the Bronx Defenders has inspired me and inspired many of my students. I want to talk today about the book that I wrote and some ideas that I have for how we can resist. The book is Locking Up Our Own, and the origins of how I came to write the book, I want to start with that. Some of y'all I know have had a chance to look at the introduction to the book. The origins really come from two places for me. One of them has nothing to do with the criminal justice system at all, and that's, I don't know if anybody else out here is like this, but I'm the kind of person who, if I go to a film and there's no African American characters in the film, I find it very frustrating. I don't like it when the movie's over, somebody says, so what did you think about this movie? And my answer is always the same, well, where were the African American characters? And I feel that way about not just film and television, but also history and politics and law. And so I knew when I wrote a book, I knew that I wanted to write a book that had African American characters front and central in the narrative. Not the best friend that gets killed at the end of the first scene, but throughout the story. The other reason I wrote the book has everything to do with the criminal justice system, and it came out of my work as a public defender. There's a lot of stories in this book. One of the stories is of a young man by the name of Brandon. Brandon had pled guilty to possession of a gun and possession of a small amount of marijuana, about $15, $20 worth, and he was facing sentencing in Superior Court in Washington, D.C. And I was his public defender. And I had taken the job because I viewed it as the civil rights issue of my generation. My parents met in the 1960s in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I still wear a button to honor them and their struggle. Their generation changed America, and they made me be able to have a life that was unimaginable to an African-American man of my father's generation. My parents were an interracial couple in the 1960s at a time when those unions were illegal in many states. And they and their generation stared down Bull Connor's dogs. They marched at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They came to Washington 250,000 strong to hear Dr. King's speech and many other speeches that day. They created the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Those things didn't come from Congress. They came from people. They came from people resisting. And as a result, I could do something like clerk on the Supreme Court, have a job as a lawyer, a public defender in Washington, D.C. At the same time, it was clear to me then that not everybody in my community had benefited from the successes of this movement. I grew up in a neighborhood in Atlanta. Before we moved to where you know, near Roosevelt, we lived a little bit further down Boulevard. In fact, where Boulevard dead ends. Now, where Boulevard dead ends in Atlanta, when I was a child, there were two huge buildings, a federal penitentiary and a Ford plant. By the time I became a public defender in the 90s, one of those buildings had closed, and the other was bigger. The term mass incarceration didn't exist when I decided to become a public defender. That term didn't come into usage until 2000. But even then, in the mid-90s, when I joined PDS, we already knew 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. We already had the number that we were 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. We already had passed Russia and South Africa to become the world's largest jailer. And that's why I became a public defender. And that's why I was representing Brandon. He had pled guilty, was facing sentencing, and I had a letter from a teacher and a counselor at his school. I was asking for him to be put on probation. His mother and grandmother were in court with me. They were just this far away in the first row. They were asking for him to come home. They had been there for every court hearing. The prosecutor in the case wanted him to go to Oak Hill. Now, Oak Hill was D.C.'s juvenile facility. And D.C.'s juvenile facility today is not good. But D.C.'s juvenile facility then was a dungeon. No functioning school, no job training programs, no mental health programs, no counseling programs, drugs and violence rampant. It was a place that, by definition, you left worse off than you entered. The judge had to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker. I changed the names, I should say, of the judges, my clients, to protect people's privacy. Judge Curtis Walker is an African-American Superior Court judge. And he looks out in the courtroom. He's got a young black man, Brandon, on trial. And Brandon was African American. If you go to Superior Court in D.C. and look at people charged with crimes, Paul Butler and others know and have said this, you would think white people in D.C. didn't commit crime. The judge has an African American lawyer for the defense and an African American prosecutor. The judge himself is African American. And he looks into Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Forman has been telling me that you've had a tough life, that you deserve a second chance. Well, son, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. See, the judge had been a child in those years. He remembered what it was like, and he proceeded to tell Brandon about that reality. Segregated bathrooms, lunch counters. And then he wrapped up and he said, so here's the thing, son. People fought, marched, and died. People gave their lives for your freedom. Dr. King died for your freedom. And I tell you this, he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your community and embarrassing your family. No, that was not his dream at all. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you turn it around. But right now, actions have consequences. And your consequences will kill. He locked him up. I went back to see Brandon. I was devastated. In the jail behind the courthouse, 3 other young African-American young men in there with him. Thought about his mother and his grandmother, probably out in the hallway crying. And I thought about the fact that, the judge wasn't alone. The city council that passed the drug and the gun laws that Brandon was sentenced under, majority African-American city council. The police force then and now, although to a lesser extent, but then and now is the majority African-American. The police chief was black then. The mayor was African-American. And I began to reflect on and ask myself the question, because it wasn't something I was really prepared for when I arrived at PDS. I had to ask myself the question, how is it that over the last 40 or 50 years, as America embarked on this policy of prison building and incarceration, the likes of which the world has never seen, how was it that so many decision makers, so many people in power in my own community ended up going along for the ride, ended up thinking that these sorts of solutions made sense? And so that's the question that animates the book, right? For me, in the title, Locking Up Our Own, how did it come to be that so many in my own community ended up in some ways participating in this madness? Some of y'all have read the book, so you know the answers. Others hopefully will purchase a copy, and the answers are there. So maybe we should just stop now and go have a reading. Let me talk about the main arguments. The first thing that we have to come to grips with is the rising violence and addiction and the fear and the anger that they generated in African American communities. Some of you will know about this in the crack years, 80s, early 90s. When I talk to my students, they remember The Wire. Just out of curiosity, because one of the things about being a teacher is that, every year, every 2 or 3 years, your students, of course, are younger and their touchstones change. And so I'm just curious, how many people in the room have watched the series The Wire in whole or in part? All right, so it's still out there a little bit. The Wire details 80s and 90s, but heroin in the 1960s, that was the crack before there was crack. In Washington, D.C., they test everybody entering the D.C. jail. And in 1963, they determined that 3% of the people entering the jail were addicts, heroin addicts. By 1969, that 3% had become 45%. Well, that's an epidemic. The homicide rate in D.C. tripled in the 1960s. Tripled in a decade. It doubled nationally. And it's not just the numbers, as important as they are, but it's also the fear and the anger that those numbers generated. So one of the things that I did was I went back and I looked at papers that have been, a lot of the African-American officials, D.C. elected officials, have given their papers over to local libraries in D.C. And they're not keywords searchable or scanned. It's paper by paper by paper, opening a file folder and pulling out a paper. When you do that for a whole summer, you discover this amazing trove of pain. People writing to their elected officials saying, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. These are mostly African-American citizens, city 70% black, writing to mostly African-American elected officials. They say, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my streets. What happened to us as a people? I can't walk my kids to school because there's dealers on the corner. I can't leave them in the park after school because they're shooting up the park. There's dirty syringes everywhere. And over again, the letters conclude with some form of do something, do something. You have to do something. Now, who's receiving these letters? That's the second big argument in the book. The people receiving these letters are the first generation of African-American elected officials coming into office in the 1970s. There's an 800% increase nationwide in black elected officials in the 1970s after the decline of formal Jim Crow and after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is a generation of people that knows the history of under-enforcement that Paul alluded to in his talk. They know. My dad used to tell me about this, and then as I did the research, I saw it more and more. You didn't call the police in the black community in the 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s. There was a robbery, there was an assault, there was a fight. The police weren't going to come. That's where 911 as a joke comes from. The police weren't going to come, and if they did, they were only going to make matters worse. Right? This is a generation of people that remembers and knew Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan. They said, that's not a homicide, that's another dead black person. And they did not use the words black person. So no, they know that history. And they are bound and determined, whatever they do, to protect that community. They want to respond to those letter writers and give them a response that they never got historically in this country. Okay. Crime and violence are a problem. People are scared. People are writing letters. The elected officials are motivated to care. And by the way, pause here just to say that this is one way in which this book, my book, is a 240-page rebuttal to the claim that was made in a part of that clip that Paul showed about Rudy Giuliani when Rudy said, well, how come they're not protesting when it's crime in the neighborhoods? How come they only protest when it's police violence? That is a complete and absolute lie. The African American community has cared to its toes, like any community would, about safety and protection, and has viewed that issue as a civil rights issue, regardless of where the harm is coming from. So the next time you hear somebody say, oh, they only care about police violence, how come they don't complain about anything else? Give them my book. Or give them a review of the book. Give them Paul's review of my book. It's a lie. It's a lie. and they got to stop telling it. We got to make them stop telling it because they're not going to do it on their own. Okay, but why this method of protection? Why police? Why prosecutions? Why sometimes even calling for more prisons to be built? This gets to the third big argument in my book. I said up front that I wanted to write a book about African American elected officials and have them and the communities that they represented and have that be central to the narrative. But since we're 12% of the population and a historically oppressed 12% at that, given the history that you just saw of racism and white supremacy, indifference to black lives in America writ large, any story that's about African American officials is also going to be a story and has to be a story about the larger society, right? The larger America that imposed constraints and limitations on the ability of African American decision makers and communities to get what they wanted. So let me talk about what some of those constraints are. The first constraint is a historical constraint, right? This group of elected officials comes into office, and they have been elected to protect communities that have been segregated, that have been redlined, that have been deindustrialized, that have had highways put right through the middle of them, destroying neighborhoods in the 1950s and 1960s. Right? They have been elected to represent communities that have had the wealth stripped out of them by usurious landlords, communities that therefore lack all the tools that they need to protect themselves. The second constraint is a political one. The people that I'm writing about are local elected officials. And one of my arguments is that local politics matters more than we understand in criminal justice policy, in how we built mass incarceration and how we're going to unwind and abolish it. But local government has its limitations. Right? So over and over again, you see in my story, you see African American elected officials doing what Doug talked about, this all of the above strategy. They say, yes, we want more police, we want more prosecutors, but we also want better housing, a fight against poverty, better schools, job training programs, drug programs, mental health programs. We want national gun control. We want Congress to pass gun control. We want a Marshall Plan for urban America. We want the United States government to do for black communities what it did for Europe after World War II. Right? Rebuild, reinvest, revitalize. But because of their limited power as local officials and because of the historical and ongoing indifference to black suffering, they didn't get that. So they had an all-of-the-above strategy, but they got one of the above, and the one of the above they got is law enforcement. The third constraint picks up on a word that Paul used in his talk and that I'm going to return to. It's, I think in some ways, the most important word of the day. They were constrained by their imaginations. You see this over and over again in my story. But I'll just give you one example. Dave Clark is one of the characters in the book. He's a city council member. In 1975, when D.C. gets a measure of home rule, there are 13 city council members elected. 11 African American, 2 white. Dave Clark is one of the white ones. He has an unusual biography. He went to Howard Law School. Unusual biography for a white guy. He went to Howard Law School. He worked with Dr. King after he got out of school, organizing the Poor People's March in D.C. He then becomes a lawyer for poor people, and when elections are announced, he decides to run. And in part because of his history of fighting for racial justice issues, he's elected in this 70% African American city. Clark is not a drug warrior. The first thing he does when he goes into office is he fights for marijuana decriminalization. First thing. He almost wins. He almost wins. The story of that's chapter 1 of the book. He doesn't. A few years later now, he's chair of the city council. And heroin, which had subsided somewhat, has come back early 80s. And Clark and the other elected officials are getting deluged with letters again. With language like, and I don't endorse this language, but it's what the letters say, there's a junkie outside of my house nodding off on the stoop. You got to get rid of him. You got to do something about this problem. There's addicts congregating in the alley. There's dirty syringes everywhere. Now, Dave Clark takes all those letters and he does what a responsible elected official should do. He forwards them to the head of the relevant government agency. He then gets a letter back from the head of that agency saying, Councilmember Clark, we've got your letters. Thank you, we're on the case. He then takes that packet of letters and sends them to the citizen. Now, I'm somebody that writes my elected officials, and I never get a response. Well, I used to write my elected officials until I read Indivisible Guide and learned that you got to call, writing doesn't matter. But Clark did good constituent services. He showed the letter writers that he had taken care of their issue. Here's the thing. What agency did he forward the letters to? Who said it? Where? Say it.
MPD, Metropolitan Police Department.
Not the Department of Public Health. Not the Department of Addiction Services. Not the Department of Drug Rehabilitation. Not an agency of social workers. Right? He sends it to MPD because he's constrained by his imagination. He's an American. And in this country, over the last 50 years, but really throughout our history, we've increasingly come to understand problems of an addict on a corner taking up public space and bothering a neighbor as a police problem, not as an addiction problem, not as a public health problem, not as a treatment program, not as a counseling program. One last argument I'm just going to touch on briefly is the question of class. There's also a class dimension to this story. Because, Paul talked about, and I think one of his important contributions, Paul talked about colorism. Paul talked about how, in his fact number 3 or 4, the darker you are, then the worse off you are in the criminal system. In D.C. and in much of Black America, there's a class dimension and a color dimension that relate to one another. Historically, in Washington, D.C., there's been a lot of color discrimination within the Black community. And then more recently, in the question of mass incarceration and the rise of punitive criminal justice, you also start to see a class distinction. I told you that story up front about Brandon. And the whole premise of the story, right, if you think about it, the whole reason why I present it as a paradox is this idea that everybody in the court shares something. Right? That's what makes this, hopefully, interesting. But it's what, right? I emphasized, everybody is African American. And that's true, but from Brandon's perspective, it could well look a little different. Because from Brandon's perspective, everybody else in the courtroom is middle or upper middle class and professional. He's poor. And even if we weren't middle or upper middle class when we were born, we now are by dint of the credentials that we have achieved. And if you look at the story of mass incarceration in Black America, it is something that afflicts everybody, and especially in the policing dimension, especially around racial profiling. But if you look at the question of who goes to prison, who actually is on trial in criminal court, there's a class dimension. If you're an African American man who dropped out of high school, you are 10 times more likely to go to prison in your lifetime than a black man who's gone to college. That class dimension, by the way, exists not just in Black America. It exists throughout America. It exists in white communities, Latino communities, and otherwise. So part of the story of the book is that the people that were making the laws did not have the full brunt of those laws enforced upon them, because they were, although not completely protected, they were somewhat protected in their upper middle class enclaves. Okay. So those are the main arguments of the book. Let me pause now and here and talk about moving forward and how to respond and how to resist and what to do about it. The first thing I want to say is that the issues that I write about in the book absolutely have not gone away. Just now, right now, in the city of Baltimore, there's a robust debate where African American legislators and the mayor of Baltimore are pushing mandatory minimums for gun possession. They're doing it in response to a real problem, which is violence and gun violence. But I see them making the same mistakes that I recount in Washington, D.C. and in other black communities over the last 40 years. Mandatory minimums are not a good idea for anybody. They are not a good idea for black people in particular. They're not a good idea for poor black people in particular. And yet that's being advocated by a community of leaders who, in my opinion, given this history that we now know, should know better. What do we do? What do we do? I want to nod one more time to Paul here. I was given a talk a couple months ago in Oakland. And at the end of the talk, I was going through a whole bunch of statistics about all of the categories of people that didn't need to be in prison, and all of the nonviolent drug offenders, and then all of their property, and all their property offenders, and then working my way down and talking about all of the people that have been in prison for a long time. And I've seen the assisted living facilities that Paul talked about. I was at San Quentin not that long ago and sat with a group of people, group of men. They were all convicted of murder. They were all in their 70s and had been in prison for 40 years. And not a single one of them was a threat to public safety and needed to be in prison. Nobody, in my opinion, needs to be in prison for 40 years. So I'm going down the list, right? Because one of my big arguments is that we can't just talk about the nonviolent drug offender and say, okay, well, we're going to have a different approach to them, but everybody else we're going to just let rot. And I'm talking all about it, and I'm telling stories of people I represented who are convicted of violent crimes and who nonetheless had incredible potential. And I was talking about I don't use the term violent offender. I oppose that as a term because it defines a person by a single moment in time. And when I was done, she came up to me and she said, "Professor Forman, you're an abolitionist." And I said, no, that's scary, reckless. What do you mean? What? She said, you are an abolitionist, you just haven't said it. She said, everything in your story is a call for prison abolition. And I said, well, what about and I'm imagining, like, there's a client I'm thinking of, and I don't think he should be in prison for his whole life, but I love him to death, but man, he can't just walk around tomorrow. That's like not going to be cool. And she said, it takes a long time. We'll get to him. Open your imagination. Right? Oh, she referenced back, because I had talked about constraints of imagination. She said, your imagination is constrained. She said, open your imagination and you will create space to think of a whole set of solutions and alternatives and approaches. And we'll work on them, and by the time we get to them, we'll have figured out that guy you're worried about. I'm not going to say more about that because I think Paul's laid out the case nicely, except to kind of emphasize how my own thinking has changed and evolved, and how I do believe very much that if nothing else, we have to start by imagining a world without prisons, because only then do we liberate ourselves mentally to be able to do all of the things that we need to put in place to make this legal system that we have less brutal and less harsh, and ultimately, I think, less destructive of America. Okay, but what about along the way? Right? Let's fill in some of that from now to the vision that we've imagined. So I want to talk not about so much a particular policy recommendation so much as to how we get there. So let me say first about within the criminal justice system. The most powerful group of people in the criminal justice system are prosecutors. The first thing that each of us has to do as citizens is demand and hold our local prosecutor accountable. Many of them are elected. And while all prosecutors, all of them, are going to do things at the end of the day that I disagree with, and probably that many of you disagree with, there are big differences in how people choose to prosecute cases, and in particular, how people choose to run their office. Big differences. Last November, for the first time in my lifetime, we saw a number over 10 or 15 prosecutors run for office on platforms like the war on drugs has devastated lives, and my predecessor locked up too many people on money bail, and we need to fix that. And nonviolent drug offenses, some of them need to be decriminalized. And the death penalty, I'm not going to pursue it anymore. Now, none of those goes as far as I want to go, but they all are a lot better than what preceded it. And here's the thing. Because citizens woke up and have noticed some of what's going on in this criminal system and how devastating it's been, that group of prosecutors, many of them who would have been laughed off the ballot in the years that I write about in this book, they won. They won. They won in Florida, they won in Alabama, they won in Texas, they won in Colorado, they won in Chicago. Civil rights lawyer in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, who spent his life suing police, just won the local DA's race, won the Democratic primary in Philadelphia. A guy in Texas who's a career defense lawyer with the words "not guilty" tattooed on his chest ran for prosecutor and won. So the first thing I want to say is, know who your local prosecutor is, right? Demand that they be accountable to you and to people like you, not just to the Fraternal Order of Police or the Corrections Corporations of America or anybody, whoever right now is lobbying and influencing them. And the reason I'm talking about local things is that 88% of the prisoners in this country are in state, county, and local facilities. My Twitter and my Facebook blow up all the time, every time Sessions says something. And he infuriates and often disgusts me with what he says and what he doesn't say when he needs to speak up and what he doesn't read that he needs to read, like the Ferguson report. Having said that, what happens at the state, county, and local level is even more important. And it's within your control to influence much more directly than you can influence what happens in the Attorney General's office. We'll influence that in the next presidential election. Okay, let's say, you know what? I hear you, Forman, about the prosecutor thing, but honestly, I'm not even getting it. Like, I just can't deal with that. Somebody else is going to have to fight the prosecutor battle. Not me, not my thing. All right, understood. Public defenders demand at the state and county level adequate funding of the public defender offices. Right now, public defender offices get 2% of the funding in our criminal justice system. 2%. I think it should be, well, we could start with 50, but if that's too crazy, okay. 10. Public defenders come up to me all the time and say things like, you know, they read this book, which in a lot of ways I've been told it's like a love letter to public defenders because we're the one group of people in the book that's like consistently heroic, which I realize is like because I'm the public defender that I'm writing about. And I didn't mean it that way, but that is how it came out. But people come up to me after some of the stories that I tell, and they say things like, you know, that was a moving story about how you fought to keep your client out of this and got prison and got them into this alternative program and saw them years later. But what you need to know is that you have more time to meet with the victim in the cases and try to persuade them than I had to meet with my client in my cases. And I recognize that PDS is a well-resourced office. And my position is that we should demand in our own communities at the state, county, and local level that we increase the funding for public defenders in our communities. Let's say though, you're one of those people who's like, you know what, the criminal justice system is one step too late. I want to do something before they get to the criminal, people get to the, I want to keep them out of the criminal system. Let's talk about school discipline. Let's talk about school-to-prison pipeline. Let's talk about zero-tolerance policies. Let's talk about the epidemic of expelling black students, black boys in particular. I mean, there are studies that come out now that document racial disparities in school suspension and expulsion for 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. And when the studies came out, I first thought it was like a joke or a fake news thing, because I was like, how could there be anybody being suspended or expelled from school in kindergarten for there to be data for a researcher to do a study to show disparities? But it's happening. Guess what? If you care about that issue, run for your local school board. That's where those policies are made. Donald Trump, Jeff Sessions, the Department of Justice, they're not, at the margins they can have an influence, but they're not responsible for most of the zero tolerance decisions that are made. There's a few that come through federal law relating to possession of guns in schools and possession of some drugs, but most of the, I represent kids facing suspension and expulsion in New Haven, and most of the policies have nothing to do with the federal government. You could change them if you were on your local school board. Let me give you a few other concrete things, right? We're on the road on the long road to abolition. But we got to take a lot of steps to get there. So let me give you a few more. If you are an employer an employee, or at a university? What is your policy? What is your school's or your employer's policy about hiring or admitting people that have criminal records? Darren Walker, the head of the Ford Foundation, went with a group of people from Ford to a prison in New York. And Ford Foundation does amazing work on criminal justice reform. And they presented this work. And at the end of it, one of the guys who was locked up raised his hand and said, "That's really inspiring to hear what you're doing around the world. I'm just curious, when I get out, could I get hired at Ford?" And there was silence in the room because they suspected the answer was no. It turned out the answer was no. But to their credit, they went back, they scrubbed their policies from top to bottom. They got rid of about 90% of the exclusions. And here's the thing they did that went further than that. They set up an affirmative, paid, with benefits, internship program, which they explicitly target towards people that have criminal records. Because one of the biggest barriers even to getting hired is the belief that you would be considered for a job. Because we've stigmatized people so terribly that they don't even fill out applications. Because I've accompanied teenagers going to apply for jobs, teenagers with criminal records. And there is nothing more demoralizing than to look at that application and see that first, second, or third box. And after a while, or have you been convicted of a crime? And after a while, you stop going. So that's why going beyond ban the box and actually affirmatively reaching out to communities and letting people know that you will hire them is a critical next step. Churches, mosques, synagogues, other religious institutions. Many of you are part of a religious community. We have about 900,000 people a year in this country who come back from prison or jail, mostly jail out of cycling. The hardest thing when you come back or you have a criminal record is reconnecting to society and reconnecting to networks that help you get housing, that help you get jobs, that help you re-enroll in school. We have 300,000 religious institutions in this country. Religious institutions were key, right, to previous movements. The abolition of slavery, the abolition of Jim Crow. 300,000. So that means that if every religious institution adopted 3 people, not 300, not 33, coming back to your local community that have a criminal record and said, we will be your home, we will be your network, we will help you find jobs, we will help you get a license. It costs $20 or $30 or $40 to get a driver's license in most places. You need an ID to get anywhere. The one they give you at prison and that you leave prison with doesn't count. People say, well, it's $20 or $30. Well, if you don't have $30, $30 is $1 million. Y'all know this, you're studying poverty. Last thing I'll say, and if there's any teachers, professors in the room, future teachers and professors, or students, because as students you can ask about this and demand this of your professors at your university. I've been giving talks, talking about what people can do, churches, and what employers can do, and what citizens can do, and DA getting involved in local races. And a couple years ago, I started reflecting on my own decisions and how I was living my life. And yeah, I speak and I write and I make a contribution as I can in those domains, but I started to think about how I could push deeper, and a big part of what I do is I teach. Right? That's fundamentally what we get paid to do as professors. And I started thinking about how I teach in this, in like one of the world's most like overwhelmingly privileged places. It's like everybody that I teach is like drenched in privilege. I'm sorry. It's true. It's true. We just got to keep it real. And I started thinking about how we've gutted funding for education in prisons in this country over, when we took out the Pell Grants in the 90s, that was an under-discussed, devastating piece of the legislation then, of the Clinton years and the Republican Congress. So I got trained in a program called Inside Out. And what Inside Out does, has anybody taken an Inside Out class at their school? A couple people. Raise your hand high, raise your hand, yeah. Yay, 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 Inside Out. Inside Out trains professors to teach courses that they teach in their university, but you teach them in prisons. And you teach them in prisons, or it could be jails as well. You teach them in correctional facilities, as much as I hate that name. Nobody's getting corrected. They teach them to half students that are incarcerated and half students from your home university, and you meet inside the prison, and you teach the normal class that you would teach. So in my case, it was a course I teach on a seminar that I teach on race and class and the criminal justice system, and we just moved from Yale to a prison about 30 miles up the road, and instead of 20 Yale Law students in a seminar table at Yale, it was in the prison with 10 students who are incarcerated and 10 law students. And I always tell teachers when I'm pitching this, I say, don't do this for self-interested reasons. It is true that the best teaching evaluations I ever got by a mile were this seminar. Don't do it for that, but the couple of the evaluations that were the most meaningful to me came from inside students. So we called the students that are incarcerated inside students, and the students from the university outside students. The inside students, one of them wrote at the end of his evaluation, he said, "I appreciated the law and the policy that you taught in this class. But more than anything else, I loved that when I came to this class, I sat around the seminar circle and you treated me like I was smart, and I felt like I had something to say, and there were even some moments where I called myself being an intellectual." And again, I thought about just the unfairness. I was happy that he had that experience in the class, the unfairness of the fact that he hadn't had that experience before. Again, I think about one of the things that causes my Yale students to be at Yale is that people acted like they were smart and had something to say from the moment they first walked into a classroom. Before that, I mean, my son is 8, and I mean, he says like the most mundane stuff. And me and my wife are like, "Oh, that's so brilliant." But for him, it was his first time. Another student wrote, James, they call each other by our first name, James. "For 2 hours a week, I felt like I wasn't in prison." So these things that I'm talking about, progressive or more reformist prosecutors, funding of indigent defense, changing our employment practices, getting on the local school board and getting rid of zero tolerance policies, teaching classes in inside-out programs. None of these by themselves is going to change or eliminate this brutal system that has been created. However, this system was built with a series of small steps by individual actors people emphasizing within whatever domain of control that they had, from police to prosecutor to the employer that decides to reject all applicants because they have a criminal conviction, everyone in this country, to the university that puts it as question number 2 and then doesn't look further and doesn't even ask themselves, well, hey, if we had a different admissions policy, would more people be willing to apply? We all did that over 40 and 50 years. Some of us deserve more responsibility than others. No doubt about it. There's some real villains in the story. But everyone in this country, in some ways, participated, either actively or through silence. And it's going to be with that same series of small steps, looking at the place that you influence, the domain that you control. If all of us collectively take those steps, then not me, not Paul, not Robin, not Harlan and Doug, not our generation, but your generation will be the generation that abolishes mass incarceration. Thank you.